talk about, what kind of roots you can expect to see. Now here, we're saying, okay, let's try and decide whether a given root is a rational number, if it's an irrational number, or maybe it's not even a real number. So what exactly are we talking about here? Okay, now the one thing you want to keep in mind is that all numbers that have square roots that will have rational values. By rational values, what do we mean? Rational numbers are basically numbers that you can write in the form of a over b. So all numbers with square roots that are rationals is what we like to call them as perfect squares. Okay, so your numbers like 49, 36, 121, 25, 9, 4, 100, these are all perfect squares because their square roots are rational numbers. Okay, so for example, you can think of 4 over 9. I was telling you about 36. These are all perfect squares. Okay, because their roots are going to be 4 over 9. Its square roots are 2 over 3 or negative 2 over 3. And then 36, of course, your square roots will be 6 or negative 6. Okay, so in each one of these you can see your square roots are rational numbers, and so that's why we can say that 4 over 9 and 36 are both perfect squares. Okay, now if you have a number that is not a perfect square, which means that if you have a number whose roots are not rational numbers, in that case you would say that it has a irrational root. And we'll go ahead and see an example here. So a number that is not a perfect square and of course that will have a square root that is not a rational number. Now for example, if you were trying to find the square root of 5, what two numbers multiplied into itself will give you 5? And as you know, 5 is only 5 times 1. So in this case, we will say square root of 5 is not a rational number. Okay. And again, why? Because I told you it cannot be written as a product of two integers. Or in this case, since we're talking about it's not rational, we would say it cannot be written as the ratio of two integers. By ratio, what do we mean? A over b, like you had 4 over 9. You cannot write square root of 5 in that form because there is nothing you can do to simplify that problem here, okay? In terms of if you were trying to evaluate what square root of 5 is, try and enter square root of 5 in your calculator and see what kind of decimal value you come up with, and you will notice that its decimal neither repeats nor it terminates. Okay, that's another good clue if you guys are not sure when you are going to see a irrational number. So its decimal will neither terminate or repeat. Other rational numbers, other irrational numbers you could see is square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 7. Pretty much all the prime numbers are going to be irrationals if you try and find their square roots. Okay. But again, remember, square root of 5 is still a real number. Okay. Just because you cannot write it in the form of a over b does not mean it is a real number. It is still a real number, and you can try and find it on the number line. Okay. So this is what we call an irrational number. Okay, so a real number that is not rational is called an irrational number. Okay, and numbers like square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, and others are what we call as irrationals. Okay, so we have looked at what a rational root would look like, what an irrational root would look like. Now the next thing we want to talk about is when a root is not a real number. Okay. Now again, just like we saw with irrationals, you want to keep in mind that, not every number will have a real number square root. To think about it, if we take the number 36, okay, and you try and find the square root of number 36. So basically what are we saying? We are saying what number can you square that will give you negative 36. Okay. If you take positive 6 and multiply it into itself, you get a positive 36. If you take a negative 6 and multiply it into itself, again, two negatives become a positive, and you still end up with a positive 36. So what do you think will give us negative 36 if we square a given real number? And you will notice there is no such number, okay, which will square and give you a negative 36. Okay, so basically we would say that the square root of negative 36 is not a real number, okay, because you cannot come up with any solution for this square root here. And of course, basically anytime you have a negative real number and you try to find its square root, the roots are always going to be non-reals, okay? They're not going to be real numbers. So if you take any value a and you try and find, if it's a negative real number and you try and find its square root, just by looking at the number, you should be able to tell this is going to be a non-real root. Okay. All right. Now that you know what to expect, what to look for, let's go ahead and look at some examples here and just try and identify what kind of roots do we have here. Do we have, a rational root, an irrational root, or is it a non-real or, not a real number? Right, so let's look at square root of 29. Let's look at square root of 169. And we'll look at square root of negative 47. So the first thing you will start out by doing is look at the radicand, which is the number inside the radical sign, and see, okay, is it a perfect square? Can I find a number that will square to give you the radicand? Look at 29. Can you think of any numbers for 29? Now 29, if you realize, is a prime number, which means that the only two factors that give you 29 is 29 and 1. So you cannot find any value as a square root here. 29 is not a perfect square. So in this case, you would say this has to be an irrational number, because again, you cannot write this square root as a rational number. That's all we're trying to do here. We're not trying to solve these. We're only trying to identify what type of square roots these are. What about our second example, square root of 169? Do you think it's an irrational number, a rational number, or is it not a real number? Now try and see what number multiplied by itself will give you 169. Now this one might take you a little bit of a time, but 169 is actually 13 squared. So if you take 13 multiplied into itself, you get 169. So that tells me 169 by itself is a perfect square. So in this case, the root is going to be a rational number, because the roots of 169 will be 13 and negative 13, and both these numbers are rational numbers. That leads us to our last number here, our last root, which is square root of negative 47. And as I told you, you can never find rational values when you have a negative inside your radical symbol. Okay, anytime your radicand is negative, you will not find a rational, and of course this is also not a real number, because no number multiplied into itself will give you negative 47 as the answer. So that is a non-real number.